Hello, we are the team minority hold choose. Our argument is that bilateral agreement with U.S. will not benefit Cuba. U.S. embargo against Cuba was started in 1960 and strengthened 2 years later. The embargo banned all the trade between U.S. and Cuba. In 2000, the embargo was softened. Therefore, U.S. started to export some goods to Cuba. However, import from Cuba are still not allowed. This chart shows the fast growth of U.S. export to Cuba after 2000. Because U.S. does not allow import from Cuba, Cuba's trade deficit against U.S. become very huge. A bilateral agreement usually benefits a country from the lower tariff. A lower tariff will lower the price of import goods and also encourage the growth of export. In the case of Cuba and America, however, Cuba has less potential to gain from export to U.S. Let's first take a look at the Cuba export. In 2000, 20% of its export was raw sugar and 29% was nickel. 10 years later, the portion of raw sugar exporting was declined to 15%, and the nickel still counted for 24%. It seems like after the bilateral agreement, U.S. would like to import sugar and nickel from Cuba, which is a good news for Cuba. However, the decline of the sugar export was because the lower production of sugar. Therefore, even if U.S. would like to import sugar from Cuba, Cuba will not able to supply. About nickel, the price of nickel declined dramatically from 2010. Therefore, trade on nickel with U.S. cannot bring much benefit to Cuba either. In conclusion, this bilateral agreement will only bring Cuba a larger trade deficit, but little growth on its export.
Cuba has tried to improve its oil production to meet its internal demand since long. However, the results turn out to be bad news. The wells are all dry. These are news from last year. In 2011, 42% of the oil consumed in Cuba are from Venezuela. More than 100,000 barrels of oils are imported from Venezuela every day. The reliance of oil demand of Cuba also lead to a large amount of debt owed to Venezuela. However, the relationship between U.S. and Venezuela is quite intense. This is an article from the New York Times. Venezuela and Cuba together rejected to trade with U.S. Cuba's bilateral with U.S., if come true, may hurt the trading between Venezuela and Cuba, which can cause terrible results. As you can see, more than 40% of imports and exports of Cuba is with Venezuela.
Next, we want to analyze the potential impact on the private business segment in Cuba if the bilateral agreement is signed. Cuba undergoes reform in the early 2000s. The reform mainly encouraged private investment with remain focused on the private employment, private renting on machinery, and private restaurants. With such kind of encourage on the entrepreneurship, the private segment experienced fast development over the last few years. From the chart, we can see that the percentage of entrepreneurship was almost doubled in 2011. However, with a short period of development, the private business segment was still very fragile, and it was still in the initial phase. In this case, it's not likely to survive the intensive competition if the company from the U.S. enter into the Cuba. Another aspect we want to talk about is the Cuba's potential attraction for FDI. Remember the case that we learned about Cambodia. Cuba also faced some same issue. The first is the demographic. Cuba has a very little population with only 11 million and a very low and even negative growth rate. From the chart, we can see that the large portion of the population in Cuba was at age over 40. And another problem is the exodus of the young people was very popular. They tend to leave the country, which means that the workforce in Cuba was very limited. Another political issue also played in their role. Cuba was a communism country, and the people tend to think that updating private sectors equals to the adopting capitalism. Education is another problem to cause to unattractive the FDI. Cuba cut the education budget in 2008, and the cutting largely declined the quality of the education. From the chart, we can see that the students enrolled in high-level education was decreased over 50% in 3 years from 2008. The labor force is not really developed, and it makes it less efficiency to attract FDI.
The reasons that Cuba will not benefit from the bilateral agreement, as we concluded, are Cuba will have larger trade deficit because of its little potential for export growth. Second, the bilateral agreement with US will cut the trading between Cuba and Venezuela. Third, the possibility of FDI is quite low because of its demographic situation of Cuba. Also, even if the FDI comes to Cuba, it will hurt the vulnerable private business, which has just started up in Cuba. Overall, Cuba will not gain from the bilateral agreement with US.